Happy Wednesday, everybody. Unfortunately, as much as I would like to have this discussion about psychoanalysis in class, my car is currently buried under a mountain of snow, and I don't see me being able to get to campus safely. So, we're going to talk about psychoanalysis here, which is actually going to be hopefully interesting for all of you because we get to talk essentially about Freud and compare what we know about what Freud said to what we know to actually be true. Um, Freud was a very influential figure, but it turns out that a lot of what he said didn't actually turn out to be supported by evidence when we did later research in psychology. So I have a picture here of what appears to be a therapist and a client. The client's laying down on a couch talking about their their concerns. The therapist is asking questions. And if you ask people who are not students of psychology what they think therapy is like, assuming they've never been to therapy, this is generally the picture that they imagine, and that's because this is what Freud did. He would actually sit in the chair and have the person just either free associate, meaning they spoke until they couldn't think of things to say, and then spoke past that so that they could expose what they truly felt, perhaps. But it's interesting that this is still what people think, even though talk therapy has actually changed quite a bit. So I want to talk about Freud and what his basic ideas were, and then maybe talk about where personality comes from according to him, and whether or not this is actually supported. So why study Freud? I just spent a moment talking about saying most of what Freud said is actually not true as we talk about how things work. It turns out that if you take what Freud said and maybe reconceptualize it a little bit and put it into modern terminology, that a lot of it is very reasonably supported by some of the theories that came after him. So Freud is definitely historically important. If you remember back to Intro Psych, if any of you had me for Intro Psych, one of the things that I said was that a lot of what happened in psychology happened as a reaction to Freud. So psychology as a discipline really flourished as a result of Freud, and that was either people who took what Freud said and ran with it, or people who opposed what Freud said, such as humanists or behaviorists or cognitive psychologists perhaps, and tried to disprove what he said. And sometimes what Freud said is actually accurate, depending on how you actually phrase it. So that's part of what I want to parse out between while talking about this. His broad ideas were great, the specific ideas not so much. So Freud, as we'll talk about, really invested a lot of consideration into this idea of the unconsciousness, or the unconscious mind, and its role on our behavior, and emphasized that we don't have access to what happens in the unconscious mind, but it's still tremendously influential for what we do. The specifics of how that works as it pertains to sexual drives and destruction drives and all these other kinds of things, those were not as well supported, and we'll talk about that. And it's culturally important. Freud actually has a pretty profound impact on our culture, as we saw from the first slide, that people think talk therapy is people laying on a couch and having a therapist talk to them about their problems. A little history about Freud. He originally had training as a medical doctor. When Hitler came to power, he actually left Austria, and historians look at what Freud said, which was largely negative about human behavior and about human disposition, and concluded to some extent that the war that surrounded Freud when he was alive may have been responsible for this. So that might be why he thinks people are aggressive and destructive, because that was what he saw. And when he left Austria, he worked with people like Franz Anton Mesmer, who was the guy who came up with mesmerization and all that kind of stuff, belief in hypnosis and animal magnetism, and these influenced his ideas as a psychiatrist. The key ideas and the controversial ideas of psychoanalysis, we're going to talk about a couple of those. So what were the things that Freud believed, largely speaking? And when you think of Freud, you probably think of things like id, ego, superego, Oedipus complex, oral stage, etc., those kinds of words that mean various things. But underlying that is this idea that Freud had called psychic determinism. Psychic determinism is the idea that, excuse me, miracles, free will, and random accidents don't exist. In our behaviors, that is. And many scientists believe this today in determinism. So the foundation of science, determinism, meaning that every behavior has a cause, suggests that there's no randomness to our behavior. If we decide to smile at somebody, there's probably an explanation that we can find. And that's kind of the point of science as a discipline, is to accept that we should be able to ask those questions and find what we're actually looking for. I'm going to show you an example of something called a Freudian slip. And I'm going to pause the video here so I can insert this, but this is a clip from the show Friends. To set up this clip, and you'll have to forgive me because much to the displeasure of many of you, I imagine, I'm not an expert in Friends, but I kind of know what's going on in the scene at least. Ross is getting married to a woman named Emily, and this is what you're about to see is the service that's taking place, this wedding ceremony. However, Ross used to date another character on the show named Rachel, and so they're exchanging vows, and he starts his vows, and we'll see what happens.
Friends, family, are gathered to celebrate here today the joyous union of Ross and Emily. Now, Ross, repeat after me. I, Ross.
I, Ross.
Take thee, Emily.
Take thee, Rachel. Emily. Emily.
Shall I go on?
He said Rachel, right? Do you think I should go up there?
Yes, do go on.
I think we'd better start again. Yes. Ross, repeat after me. I, Ross.
I, Ross.
Take thee, Emily.
Take thee, Emily. I don't think there'd be anybody else.
As my lawfully wedded wife in sickness and in health, till death parts us.
As my lawfully wedded wife, in sickness and in health, until death parts us. Really, I do. Emily.
You have the rings? Emily, place this ring on Ross's finger as a symbol of your bond everlasting. Ross, place this ring in Emily's hand as a symbol of the love that encircles you forever.
Happy to.
Ross and Emily have made their declarations, and it gives me great pleasure to declare them husband and wife. You may kiss the bride.
This is worse than when he married the lesbian.
Okay, so hopefully as you saw in that clip, Ross actually said the name of an ex-lover, essentially, during his wedding ceremony. He became incredibly flustered and embarrassed, as did Emily. And this, according to Freud, is not just a coincidence or an accident, and I think that's pretty clear in terms of the comedy that's associated with the clip, that maybe that means that they're actually still, or he's still in love with her. And that would be Freud's idea here. This is also a good example of Freud's cultural legacy, too, that those kinds of things still exist. Even though it wasn't called a Freudian slip, it's still a very good example. And one of Freud's other key ideas is the importance of the unconscious mind, which is not something that psychologists are really interested in or studying at the time. If you remember, and going back to intro psych, at the time, really what psychology focused on before Freud came along and started proposing these ideas was things like structuralism, which is what is happening in the consciousness and how can we use that to understand human behavior. Using introspection, which is thinking about the consciousness, or functionalism, which is studying the functions of different parts of human thoughts or behaviors. But Freud suggests that there's a lot more than meets the eye in terms of what actually explains behaviors, and this tends to be his greatest legacy, this contribution that he had about consciousness, and unconsciousness more specifically. So here's a nice picture that depicts the, we'll talk about what the ego, superego, and the id are in just a second. Actually, let me do that now, very briefly. The superego is essentially the part of our minds that knows what is moral and what's right. So things that your parents tell you that you should and shouldn't do, or society tells you that you should and shouldn't do. The ego is actually the part of our conscious mind that helps us dictate our behavior and decide what we're going to do. The id is entirely embedded within the unconscious mind, and it contains our impulses and desires that we don't feel comfortable expressing. And according to Freud, these are often sexual desires or destructive desires or something like that. So the way that the mind works, according to Freud, is that we have the ego, which essentially takes input from the id, from the unconscious id, this devil on your shoulder, if you will, and takes input from the angel on your shoulder that says what you should do and tries to make some kind of a decision. So the mind is kind of in a constant state of conflict between these two components of the superego and the id, and the ego's job is really to try and negotiate that. This black horizontal line here represents the distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness. Everything above the line is what's contained in consciousness. Everything below the line is unconsciousness. So what this says is that we're aware of what society says, this superego. We're aware of what our conscious is, what we're thinking about at the time. We're not aware of what the id wants or what our desires are. We try to suppress that from our conscious mind because it's too troubling for us. So it's troubling to think, I really want to hurt this person or cheat on this exam, or I really want to do this really bad thing. We don't want to think that. That's not something that we feel good about if we acknowledge that thought. So according to Freud, we have things called defense mechanisms, and there's an entire paper that you guys get to read about defense mechanisms that talks about all these different things. But moving onward, the definitions and components of our mind. So Freud thinks that the mind is made of separate parts that function independently in conflict with each other. So basically we have three parts of our mind, this id, ego, and superego, and they all want different things to happen. The id is irrational and emotional, so it's very impulsive, it's very desire-driven. The superego is more moral, it's more about what's right and what should do and what you should do. And the ego is something that's rational. And oftentimes what the ego's job is to figure out how to placate or satisfy the id and the superego at the same time. So perhaps this might be something like justifying your behaviors. If the id says, I really want to hurt this person, and the superego says, you shouldn't hurt this person, doing that's wrong, maybe the ego, the rational mind, might come up with some way to insult somebody or harm somebody or subconsciously act rude to them in a way that doesn't trigger this sense of doing that has been wrong. And modern research, according to these different structures of the mind, suggests that our mind has a lot of different components that operate in tandem, but they're not really broken down into superego, ego, and id. If you look inside the brain, you're not going to find the pieces of the mind that actually correspond with those things. And additionally, we're often aware of our irrational and emotional things. We're often very aware of these desires that we have that Freud would say would be uncomfortable for us. So it's not quite as Freud described it, but the fact that we do have this unconscious desire, and that's very well supported in the research. We have things that we do without realizing it all the time, and explanations for things that we're totally unaware of, and that's really his greatest legacy. So one of the important ideas behind Freud's theory is this idea of compromise formation. And I want you to know what compromise formation is because it's actually very important. It's essentially the negotiation that the ego does with the id and the superego. So you may be sitting at home and you have the option of going to class and the id is saying, I want cake. I don't want to go to class, I want to go eat some cake. The superego says, no, you have to go to class, you should go to class. And the ego can actually do a compromise, which is, well, if I go to class, then I've done something good, so I've earned the cake. So in that sense, it's a compromise. And modern psychoanalysts actually examine this compromise that people make. So if people are justifying their behaviors using this kind of strategy, then you can look at whether or not these things are connected. If, for instance, a person wants to eat less cake, and through therapy they reveal that they justify eating cake through doing good things, you could point out that those things aren't really connected to each other, and maybe find other strategies to help the person. Freud also had this idea of mental energy, which he called the libido, or the life force, if you will. And what the libido is it's a fixed and it's a finite amount of energy that we have. So if you think of the libido as kind of this container of water, and we have all these different desires and we have all these different developmental stages, we can only allocate that amount of water to different places before we run out of water. And we're going to talk about how that becomes problematic for people in just a moment. Do we have fixed and finite amounts of mental energy? It depends on how you define mental energy. Probably people wouldn't think of things as mental energy. They might think of it as concentration, or they might think of it as multiple kinds of thoughts, and so it becomes a little more nuanced. But let's talk a little bit more about what Freud meant by this thing called a libido. For instance, Freud believed that if you don't express your emotions, they're going to build up until we have no choice to release them. So Freud's theory came from people who he spoke with through therapy who had these problems, and what he found is within some of his clients that those who were experiencing these problems had this really pent-up aggression and they had no way of releasing it. And if they had a way to outlet this aggression, maybe they'd feel better. So he proposed that if the id has these desires and we just kind of suppress the id too much without finding a way to satisfy the id, then the id's eventually going to become a sort of beyond our control for a moment until we release the desire, and then we can kind of start over. Does modern research support this? No. At least not in terms of expressing emotions. And this comes from catharsis research. So Brad Bushman and other researchers have actually talked about the idea, well, catharsis is this idea of cleansing, or releasing, if you will, different emotional urges or expressions. So if a person gets angry and angrier, is the solution to go and do something that will allow them to act on that anger, or is there a better solution such as maybe relaxation techniques or mindfulness exercises? And it turns out that if you have people behave angrily or express their emotions through anger, it actually makes them feel more angry rather than less angry. So that does not support this catharsis idea. The way to address emotions like that and to control emotions like that is actually to do things like mindfulness meditation and to relax the self and to teach people how to control and address their emotions rather than just kind of act on them impulsively. So this particular idea of Freud's wasn't really well supported by research. Although if you have this building anger and you don't do anything about it, that will distress people, obviously, and they may act on anger. So that might happen, but that doesn't mean that it actually reduces their anger after the fact. It can actually increase their anger. Freud also had ideas about this libido being finite, and that's, if you think about it in terms of mental health implications, it's actually, there's some truth to it. And what we know from modern cognitive psychology is that our information processing capacity is limited. Meaning that if you're watching this video right now and texting on your phone or doing other things, that you're not devoting your full attention to it, it's going to inhibit your information processing capacity, perhaps. Some people, and this is an aside, some people like to do other things while they're paying attention to the video, and it helps them to concentrate, or it's it's individualized. But we do have a limited information processing capacity, and this is seen pretty clearly when we talk about mental health and chronic worrying. If you have a person with generalized anxiety disorder, for instance, they're worried all the time about little things. And if you examine what they're doing in their lives, they're trying to get a lot of things done, but this constant intrusive worrying, and this, what I have here is rumination, just thinking about these different problems that exist, this prevents them from actually accomplishing a lot of things. And if you actually sit them down and have them try to, for instance, study material, or if you have them try to focus on a task, they find it very difficult because their mental energy, in Freud's terms, is being occupied by this chronic worrying. So the libido, as we've talked about, is life energy. Freud also, in some senses, called it a sex drive because he saw that sexual activity was something akin to life. I mean, there's procreation as a part of sexual activity, and Freud didn't really talk about homosexuality or non-heterosexuality as much, so there was sort of an assumption of heterosexuality in his theory. But the libido, or their sex drive, was associated with creation, protection, enjoyment of life, creativity, productivity, growth. So these are all positive connotations, this libido. It's one of the motivations that we have. We want to do all of these things. And we're going to talk about existential psychology in the next unit, and humanistic psychology. And this is really similar to things like self-actualization, if you remember from intro psych. If you don't, it's okay. But this idea that we want to be the best person that we can be and achieve all of these things and experience all these wonderful things. We also, according to Freud, and this is where a lot of people disagree, is have this destruction drive. So sometimes we just want to do things that are bad. We want chaos, we want randomness, we want disorder. And I have the reminder here that Freud witnessed war, which could have influenced his decision to say that this is one of the fundamental drives that we have, this destruction drive. But other theorists would, from a philosophical perspective, argue that there's not really a need to assume that we have a destruction drive, and that maybe there are other reasons that we would act that way. But these two drives, libido and thanatos, I think he actually referred to the libido as corresponding with eros. And I don't know if any of you have studied Greek or Roman history, but eros and thanatos were gods. And I don't remember if it was with Greek or Roman gods specifically, but eros was the god of love and sexuality, essentially. Thanatos was the god of destruction. So that's why Freud came up with these terms as drives. Freud also had this idea of the doctrine of opposites. I have the quote from your textbook here, the optional textbook, which says that extremes on any scale may be more similar to each other than either extreme is to the middle. And that quote may not make a whole lot of sense until you really dissect it. But I'm going to talk about an example that I hope will actually clarify here. I'm going to use the example of emotionality. And we've talked about emotionality in the context of the neuroticism in the Big Five, the neuroticism subscale. We've talked about emotional stability. And we talked about how, I'm going to see if I can draw on the screen here. Let's say this is the entire spectrum of neuroticism. And here is high on neuroticism, and here's low on neuroticism. So let me write neuroticism. I'm writing remarkably well. Oh, as I said that, of course, the C got all messed up. This is a neuroticism scale. We talked about in the Big Five unit how people who are really high on neuroticism experience a lot of emotional instability. They're chronically concerned with their emotions, and they have a lot of difficulty regulating them. So this is problematic because they're very troubled often. People who are very low on the scale of neuroticism, they are unable to really experience appropriate emotions. So we talked about how if somebody has a 0 score on neuroticism, they may not experience any worry at all. They may do things like go and pick up a snake and play with a snake in spite of the danger that's associated with it. And we said that somewhere in the middle is actually the preferable place to be when it comes to neuroticism. It turns out that we want to be somewhere around here, where we are, because neuroticism is valenced, meaning that it's good to not have high neuroticism, we want to be here at about the 75th percentile. 75th percentile of this. So we're not completely incapable of feeling emotions or feeling worry or fear, but we're also not overcome for it like it is on the high end of the spectrum here. How does this relate to the doctrine of opposites? What Freud would say is that people who are low in neuroticism and high in neuroticism actually experience the same thing. They have difficulty regulating their emotions as it's appropriate. So people who are low in neuroticism don't experience fear when it would be beneficial to them. People who are high in neuroticism don't experience pleasant emotions when it would be appropriate and beneficial to them. But people who are kind of in the middle somewhere, maybe even this entire range, they can experience a lot of emotions, and particularly when it's appropriate for them. So this is the doctrine of opposites. Freud also came up with a stage theory in psychology, a psychosexual developmental stage theory. And I don't want to speak too much about what the different stages are and burden you with memorizing the different components of the stages, because there's not a lot of evidence to support these stages and what happens in them and how they actually influence people's personalities. But I do want to talk about them in the context of what modern research says is actually supported. So psychosexual development involves going through these different stages in life, and each of these stages, as we grow older, has a physical focus, a psychological theme, and an adult character type. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here on this next slide. Here are the 5 stages that Freud proposed: the oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital stage. These are all loosely focused on because the libido is involved excuse me, on achieving some sort of outcome and satisfying the self so that you cannot have to worry too much about things that are going on. The oral stage happens approximately from birth to 18 months. The principal task, the behavior, is weaning. So this is how you graduate from the stage, if you will. What Freud's idea was is that babies have to achieve nourishment through their mouths, and if they are given too much nourishment, this could create an oral fixation. So you may have heard that term before. Or if they don't receive enough nourishment, this could create kind of an oral fixation in the opposite direction. And this can actually influence people's perceptions of how available resources are and affect their stability in some sense. So there's some connection, if theoretically, to different personality characteristics. And we're going to talk about attachment theory as well, where this would be actually quite relevant, the oral stage. The anal stage was between 18 months and 3 to 4 years, and toilet training was the principal component here. So according to Freud, babies essentially were potty trained. And during potty training, you can exert some kind of control over the situation. If your parents said, go use the potty, you could say, no, I'm not going to do it. Or you could decide to just do it too much. And these are, if you've ever heard the terms anal retentive and anal, well, anal retentive is quite common. And Freud, Neo-Freudians talked about being anal retentive. The converse to that is anal expulsive, which is disgusting, but I'm going to mention it because it pertains to the big 5 trait of conscientiousness. So people who are anal retentive, that's the kind of like they have to have things their own way, they have to be in control of situations. That's associated with conscientiousness. Anal expulsiveness is just kind of doing whatever you want and not really focused on how things are your own way, and not so much being easygoing, but just kind of being maybe messy or not really preoccupied with that kind of thing. The phallic stage is between 3 and 7 years approximately. Freud believed that it was around this time that children became aware of which genitals that they had, and if children were biologically male, Freud argued that they would experience the Oedipus complex, which is they would become jealous of their father because they wanted to be sexually involved with their mothers. And this is where the superego develops, because they learn they have to do what their fathers and their mothers say in spite of their desires. Notice that I didn't mention what happens to little girls, and Freud didn't either. He talked about things called, Freud talked about penis envy, which suggests that women are inherently going to experience more issues, and that's rooted in his studies on hysteria, which was very gender biased against women. But the task in this is a sexual identity, and Freud believed, and his followers, not followers like he led like a group of people around or anything like that, followers in terms of like his successors as psychoanalysts, believe that this is kind of where sexual orientation develops at this stage, depending on what takes place during the realization of what kind of anatomy you have. He then said there's a latent stage, which is 5 to 7 years after the phallic stage through puberty, and during this stage there's really no interest in sexual desire. It's latent, and learning is the principal task. And then when you achieve puberty, this is the genital stage. This is kind of the ideal stage. And genital intercourse is the task here. So there's a lot going on in this stage theory. And there are other stage theories that have come afterwards and that are to some degree supported by evidence. The idea that what happens in our early life affects how we become as adults is a good one, and it's actually well supported in attachment theory and in Piaget's developmental stages. The idea that it has to do with oral gratification or anal gratification or anything like that is not so much supported by research. So let us move on. Freud, and this is where personality becomes relevant here. How does personality develop? Freud's theory of personality is that a healthy adult personality is one where they successfully are able to get through all of the stages without incurring a lot of stress or trauma. So if you get through the oral stage without having to develop an oral fixation or any other kinds of issues, then you'll become, a healthy adult without a lot of major psychological problems. If during these stages you experience some trauma, that's going to create a fixation. And remember, the libido is something that is finite and fixed. So we only have a certain amount of psychic energy to go around. And if we had a conflict, say, in the oral stage of our childhood, there's a certain amount of our libido that's taken away, essentially, and dedicated to that fixation. So we now have less of it to use as adults accomplishing those healthy tasks that we want to. And people who experience the most issues, according to Freud, are those who had conflict at many stages. And the analogy that your textbook gives you is that you can think of growing up and going through these stages as having an army of psychic energy that's conquering hostile territory. So you start with this army, and you get to your oral stage, and you experience a battle. And if you're really successful in that battle, then none of your troops are left behind. If you're not successful, a lot of your troops are left behind, and this is a fixation, so you have less moving forward. If you started with 100 soldiers and you had a really bad oral stage and you left it with only 50 soldiers, then that's all that you have left to get through the rest of the stages and into adulthood. Retreating to a previous stronghold is called regression. We haven't talked about regression as it pertains to Freud, but that's behaving like you are in a particular stage. So when people become very distressed, sometimes they behave somewhat childlike, and they struggle to regulate their emotions. And this is Freud's explanation for this, is that they're dwelling on their fixation. And victory is reaching the genital stage with most of the army or the energy intact. So we had a fairly successful childhood, and we grew up, and now we're adults, and we are able to have most of our psychic energy still. Another analogy might be a bucket of water with holes. So if you have a full bucket of water when you're born, and one part in the oral stage gets punctured, then it starts leaking, and now you only have this much of the bucket. And then maybe somewhere else another puncture happens, and you only have this much of the bucket left. So personality essentially is, what are we dwelling on in terms of the things that happen to us? And you might be saying, well, I have no idea what my childhood was like when I was 18 months old, or even when I was 3 and 4 years old. And this harkens back to Freud's idea that, well, you may have that, but you might actually be repressing that memory because it's troubling to you. But we can study what you're doing to make inferences about your unconscious mind. One of the things that he said, for instance, is that people who had an oral fixation would do things like eat too much, or they would chew on pens or pencils, or they would always need to be kind of chewing on gum or some other kind of thing where they're gratifying themselves orally. And this could be something that would be evidence perhaps of some issue that happened during that beginning of their lives. And this all sounds like, oh, maybe this makes sense. Maybe Freud's not as wacky as as Dr. M said he was at the beginning of this video. We're not done yet. I like this graphic. It talks about the ego and the superego and the id. A lot of people draw an analogy to an iceberg where consciousness is predominantly consistent of the ego, although the superego often creeps up into consciousness, but the id is entirely below consciousness here. So what's wrong with psychoanalytic theory? Well, a lot, at least the classic Freudian. First of all, it's extremely complex. If you're trying to explain why a person's eating too much, for instance, or why they're chewing on a pen, or why they may have anxiety issues or other kinds of things, in Freud's model, you have to essentially go through their entire lifespan and study in great detail their life and their unconscious mind to figure out what the problem was. When modern theories can actually address it much easier without invoking this idea of the unconscious mind, and much more successfully. So it's incredibly complex. Freud's theory came from something called the case study method. Freud studied 12 people who came to him because they had specific problems. So his theory was not actually developed as most psychologists would by studying everyone. It was by studying a subsample of people who were struggling with issues and examining how they were coping. There's vague definitions of things. What does it mean to have an oral fixation? Is it chewing on a pen? Is it chewing on a gum? Is it whatever? That's really difficult to define, and if you're trying to identify somebody who has an oral fixation, it's often very subjective. Maybe chewing on gum is not something that's the worst thing in the world. I showed you an image earlier in this presentation where Freud said something like, a cigar is just a cigar, or sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And Freud was essentially saying, well, doing all these other things with your mouth is an oral fixation, but a cigar is okay. Why? That doesn't make any sense. It's not testable. It can't be proven false. So if somebody approaches you with some kind of an issue and they say, I'm having trouble in my romantic relationship, you might respond, well, that's because you had some kind of an issue with your Oedipus complex and you had issues with your mother and she did this, and that's one possible explanation. Bearing in mind the fact that it's not easy to collect the evidence to see if that actually took place. But you could also come up with some other kind of an explanation too. Maybe somebody says, I have dreams where I see, and this is actually a story that I think other people have talked about. Like, I have dreams where I see like these telephone poles all over the place, and there's these big structures, and one Freudian might say, well, you have penis envy, or you have a preoccupation with genitalia, and these are symbolic of those kinds of things. Or another Freudian might say, well, these are tall structures because you have trouble with authority, and it's because of an underdeveloped superego. Or you're experiencing this defense mechanism and you're not appropriately expressing yourself. So because the theory can come up with so many different explanations, you can't prove it wrong, because you can always come up with a reason according to this model of why. A really good example of untestability that I like to give is, at this point, I would ask you all, how many of you believe everything that Freud said? And I'm going to guess that none of you would be raising your hands right now. And I can't see you, but I'm going to take a guess because I've taught this material before, and usually people think that Freud is out of his mind, and everything that he says, while there might be some merit to it depending on how you talk about it, it's not true. The fact that you think that Freud isn't true could be an instance of denial, where you're refusing to accept what Freud says because it's threatening to your self, and so your ego defense mechanism is to just deny that it's true at all. That's why it's untestable and unfalsifiable. And lastly, for cultural reasons, it's kind of sexist. It assumes that being male is the default and that women are predisposed to experience more problems because of things like penis envy and because of things like the Oedipus complex. And there's no reason to assume that. There's no reason that needs to be the case. So modern theorists were reactive to that. Karen Horney, who you have a paper to read about, actually talks about this and expands on Freud's ideas. And other theorists don't even talk about Oedipus complexes or genitals or anything like that. But this is a basic Freud overview, and he's a very historically relevant person in terms of personality and in terms of psychology. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that we can talk about where to go with this information with Neo-Freudians next time.